So here's the problem. The composable you wrote last month returns an object, but you really need it to return an array. Unfortunately, it's all over your code base and it would require a lot of refactoring to do so. If only you had taken more time in the beginning to really flesh out how you want to use this composable, maybe we could have avoided this issue. You see, your composable isn't future-proof. In this lesson, we'll learn about writing interfaces for our composables, which will hopefully allow us to write composables that serve us far into the future. You may be tempted when you first need a composable to start implementing it immediately. However, I recommend starting by thinking through how you want that composable to be used. This is what I mean when I say write the interface first. Instead of starting with the implementation, take the time to think through how it should be used. Another way to think about this is by creating the blueprint, or, the API for the composable. The boundary between the composable and other pieces of your app. It's just like building a building. It's going to be harder to make changes once the building is built. It'll be easier if we create very thought-through blueprints at the beginning. We won't have to make changes later. You may have noticed that when you have reusable code, like a component or a composable, when you first write it, it has a lot of volatility. You're still fleshing out how you want to use it. There's a lot of edge cases and you end up recoding it a bunch. Instead, if we can anticipate most of these edge cases at the beginning, we can save ourselves a lot of work. If we want to start with our interface inside of our composable, we can ask 3 questions. First, what arguments do we pass to our composable? Is it a ref, a raw value, or series of values? Second, what options should be in our options object? If you're not familiar with this, see lesson 1 of this course. Thirdly, what values does our composable return? Is it a single value or a dynamic return pattern, like we saw in the last lesson? These don't have to be answered in a specific order, but most should be figured out. You might notice as you start answering one question, you might better understand how to answer the others. It serves as more of a guide than a rigid process to follow. You'll notice each of these questions involve how we use or interact with the component. It doesn't deal with how the component actually works inside. We'll get to that, but only after the interface. Let's dive into an example you're already familiar with, the useMouse composable. Remember, this allows us to get the mouse position on our screen. So first off, what arguments do we pass into our composable? Well, none. We want to return the coordinates. Okay, that's easy. Second question, what options should be in our options object? We might want to specify the type of mouse position coordinates we want, either based on the whole page or just what the client can view in the browser. This will default to page. We might want to configure if we listen for touch events, like if the user has a touch screen, we might want to return the coordinates of where they've touched on their iPhone. And if this is true, we'll listen for touch move events. This will default to false. If we're listening for touch events, we might want to reset when touch ends. This will reset to the initial value on the touch end event. This will default to false. And lastly, we might want to specify the initial value. This will default to 0 and 0. Our last question is, what values does our composable return? Here's where it might be useful to write out how we're going to call this method to discover how we might need to use it. This process can give us a lot of clues on what our interface might be. Obviously, we want to return X and Y, but we might want to know if it gets those coordinates with the mouse or from a touch screen. So let's return source type, which will be either mouse or touch. The options I showed you on the previous slide and these return values you see here are the actual return values from the useMouse composable. The next 2 calls I'm just making up. If we wanted to store the X and Y inside a position object, we might have a return value with position and source type. And if we also want to have the X and Y in an array, we might also want to do this, position, position array, and source type. At this point, you can see we have a pretty good understanding about how we might want to use this useMouse composable. But of course, requirements change over time. So this isn't set in stone. And you can see how much our interface changed just by prototyping a bit. If we had just gone with our first guess, well, we might have written a composable that would need to be refactored real soon. In this lesson, we learned about how thinking critically about our composable from the start can lead to a better implementation and less refactoring in the long run. We won't need to refactor because we've been thoughtful from the beginning about how we might use this. Of course, we don't want to spend too much time on this process. There's only so much you can anticipate, and requirements change often. There's no perfect interface, but hopefully by putting a little more effort into it, we can avoid a headache or two.